Our next presenter is Dr. Phil Dorrell, Assistant Professor of Religion at Wofford College, and an expert especially on Islam in Turkey. Phil.
Do I get a PowerPoint too, maybe?
Yeah.
Cool. That's okay. Oh, perfect. Okay. I'm pretty loud. So, what I want to do today is give some sort of just basic, cold, hard numbers and a basic introduction to the Syrian crisis itself. And I'm also going to tack on to the end of this presentation, because there's some serious interest in this, a history and an explanation of what's going on with ISIS. In my capacity as Islamic Studies, I'm also called to address these things, so I'm just going to go ahead and do that. Next slide, please. So Syria right now, since the beginning of the conflict in 2011, March 2011, a full 1/2 of all Syrians have either been killed or displaced as a result of the conflict. If you don't mind just clicking through some numbers and pop up. 6.5 million displaced within Syria, 4.1 million refugees living abroad registered, between 200,000 and 300,000 killed, the majority of which have been killed by the Assad regime, the vast majority. And the Syrian refugees now, most are in neighboring countries, though some have begun to flee to Europe and elsewhere. The majority of these refugees, largest number of them, are about 2 million in Turkey, which sort of opened its borders to this flood of refugees shortly after the conflict began. About 1 million living in Lebanon, which if you know anything about Lebanon, it's a very, very small place, so an increase of 1 million people is absolutely gigantic. Syrian refugees probably take up an enormous percent of their population right now. Turkey itself, 2 million is also a lot for a country of roughly 80 million people. And then about 600,000 in Jordan. Behind Jordan, roughly 130,000 in Egypt. About 250,000 in Iraq, and some 350,000 currently seeking asylum in Europe. Many of these are actually in refugee camps in Turkey at the moment, and are applying for asylum status in Europe at the speak, or they're trying to apply directly, but most of them probably are living in refugee camps inside Turkey, close to the Syrian border. And in the United States, about 1,500 are currently living in the United States at this point. So 0.03% of all refugees from the Syrian crisis are now living in the United States. The origins of the conflict. So I'm going to go a little bit into the history of the Assad regime, and it's essentially the entire reason why this conflict started in the first place. Since 1970, Syria has been ruled by a secular Ba'athist dictatorship. The Ba'ath Party is a sort of standard nationalist, Arab nationalist ideology. They took control in 1970 with the leadership of Hafez al-Assad, who was the father of Bashar al-Assad. He ruled until 2000, and his son from 2000 until today. The regime's methods for staying in power are the primary reasons that the Syrian civil war has gained the horrific violence that it has, and has also played a major role in producing what we now know as ISIS, and so we'll be going into that in a second. So the main reasons why the single-party state in Syria existed for a good 30, 40 years, it was and continues to be the place where it still exists, a totalitarian police state based on mass torture, sexual violence, imprisonment, and killing. Corrupt economic reform. Once Bashar al-Assad took control in 2000, he began a process of economic modernization that was very, very selective and empowered a network of business elites connected to the regime, but was distributed in no equal or democratic way among the actual populace. He essentially created a strong class of people who were indebted to the regimes and its survival. This is part of the reason why Assad has retained supporters inside Syria, because a massive proportion of the Syrian business elite and the Syrian population that has benefited from these reforms is loyal to that regime, but the other half of the population has been massively disenfranchised and oppressed by them. His regime also used a fairly classic tactic used inside multi-ethnic, multi-religious nations, divide and rule sort of method of dealing with religious diversity, where the dictatorial government turns religious groups against each other. The Syrian regime, the Ba'athist regime in Syria, is run by the members of the Alawite sect, for lack of a better term, but a group of religious individuals that are somewhat analogous to Shiism inside Islam. And despite the fact that the majority of the population is Sunni with large Shia minorities and large Christian minorities as well in the Jewish community, in addition to the small Jewish community, these groups were never able to really rise up and become a unified force because the regime did a good job of convincing them that they were each other's enemies. A similar tactic was employed by the Soviets in places like Ukraine. This had a major role in producing the genocidal violence that came after the fall of the Soviet Union and also after the Soviet-backed regimes in places like the former Yugoslavia. And of course, the Syrian regime stayed in power for this long primarily because, or one of the major reasons, because of its strong backing by Russia and Iran. Russia has a large military presence in Syria, maintains bases and bases of operation there, protects them with great enthusiasm, and Iran also has seen Syria as a partner in its foreign policy, in its sort of long-standing rivalry against Saudi Arabia and other powers allied with Gulf states. The war begins in 2011, but why has the conflict gone on as long as it has? A few reasons for this. Excuse me. The opposition is fragmented. The opposition has never been able to achieve a kind of mass movement the way that it did in other Arab Spring countries like in Egypt or in Tunisia, partially because large portions of the population, the elites that I mentioned before, continue to benefit from the patronage of the regime, partly because the regime had been able to convince large numbers of its citizens that they were under the threat of radical